My name's Andrew Epstein. I am a volunteer tour guide here at the American Museum of Natural History. Thank you for sticking around after that wonderful video. I liked it myself. That fellow you watched, Steve Quinn, is someone I volunteered on some projects that he oversaw. And so always like seeing him. So what we're going to do today is we're mostly going to talk about coral. We're going to talk about coral here in the diorama that was in the video, and we'll go to somewhere else in the hall. We'll talk about corals there. And as we go along, I hope you'll have some questions. I will answer them as best I can. And I think we can get started. So I have notes, and you see me look to the left. I'm glancing down at my notes. I also have the slides we're going to be looking at, so I might look a little bit there too. But mostly I'll be talking directly to you. So this is a photograph of the one part of the Andros Coral Reef exhibit. And what we're going to talk about first is what is a coral and why are they so important. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a bunch of tiny little animals. Now, when we talk about coral, we're talking about the animals that you see here, and they look really big, but of course, they're only a few millimeters across. They've got these little tentacle-like things they use to help feed. They will grab tasty material that's floating in the water, and they'll suck it in. They're only maybe 5 millimeters tall. They're all different kinds of corals. I mean, many, many different species, but we can group them different ways. So the corals in the diorama are not real. And the video talked a little bit about how they remove them, but basically they just sawed them off. They got 40 tons of coral from the Bahamas. And just as a reminder, that is not something we would ever do today. This is the 1920s and 30s we're talking about. And the museum saw things, well, science saw things differently. So there are what they call soft corals that can actually exist couple thousand feet under the ocean. And if you're familiar with these corals, these stony or hard corals, that might surprise you. It certainly surprised me. Somebody asked me, what's the deepest coral? And I just had it completely wrong, because there are different kinds of corals. But these kinds of coral animals, they get about 10% of their energy from what they can grab with their little tentacles and shove it into their mouths. About 90% of their energy comes from dinoflagellates that use photosynthesis, chlorophyll, just like plants, green plants on land. And they use energy from the sun, and they share it. There's a mutualistic sort of relationship. The dinoflagellates, sometimes people call them a kind of algae. Algae is a very general term, it turns out. But the dinoflagellates, they give up sugar, they give up amino acids, they give up things to keep the coral animal healthy. In return, the coral gives the dinoflagellate carbon dioxide, some phosphates, and other things. So they're going back and forth. And the corals that are like the ones you see on the next slide that we can see, they are relying on this mutual benefit sort of relationship. Now, because they are relying on the dinoflagellates that are living with their chlorophyll using photosynthesis, these kinds of coral are generally living very near to the surface, 20, 30 feet within, usually, maybe 60. But as you go deeper in the water, the sunlight gets dimmer and dimmer. And notably, the color changes also. And so where you find these is fairly shallow water. Now, why coral reefs? So how many species there are, that's something I didn't write down, but I think if I said hundreds, I wouldn't be wrong. But how common are corals? And what we're talking about is coral reefs. I said coral is the animal, but as part of their life process, what they do is they take in calcium carbon from the water, and they exude a calcium carbonate mineral. And they, through biochemistry, their life, they will, shoot out a little bit of calcium carbonate, and that is the rock part. Like if you have, I think it's October, coral is the birthstone sometimes. But that rock is what is manufactured by these corals. Now, 1/10. So let's look at the where we are in a little bit of geography. So the Andros Coral Reef is not that far from the museum. We're on the east coast of the United States in New York, not very far from the Hudson River. And if you follow the east coast of the United States down, you see that bright turquoise color. And I don't know if you make it out, but it actually, I think, says the Bahamas. And that's where the Andros Reef is. And we can zoom in there. The biggest island of the hundreds of islands is Andros. Grand Bahama is north of it, extending east and west. But Andros Island is bigger than all the other islands put together. And there's a little dot, and it says Andros Barrier Reef. That's principally where the material that we see in the diorama in the museum was collected from. Very close to the shoreline. There's a little barrier reef there. So it's not the only reef in the world, and less than 1/10 of 1% of the ocean floor is occupied by coral reefs. And let's take a look at where we find them in the world. All those dots are where you can find coral reefs of different kinds. So we can generalize a little bit. If you notice, it's above and below the equator fairly closely. So they need a little bit of warmth, and we know already that these kinds of corals require shallow places. So the teal gemsbok asks, what do corals do to the ecosystem? What is their purpose? Well, they feed life on Earth. About 25%, more than 25% of marine life depends at least some point in their lives on corals. Now, when you look at all those dots, you think, oh, that's a lot. But it's just so we can see the dots. If you were to actually look at the total surface area, it's much smaller than that. So this percentage-wise, this very small percentage of our ocean has a very, very large influence on the biosphere, on life on Earth. And when we talk about ecosystem, that's where I'm going. I'm saying it's about life on Earth, and there's absolutely vital. So let's take a zoom back in to the museum, the Milstein Family Hall of Ocean Life. And if you notice on the bottom there, that's what the picture was before. And on top, as Steve mentioned, it's a two-story diorama, the only one in the museum. And there's this wonderful painting on top, a guy named Fuertes, I think, with these towering clouds. So let's start up there on the mezzanine level, and we'll move down. There we go. So this is not quite close in. I wanted to show this because the people that put this diorama together really wanted to bring you not only to this lagoon, to this barrier reef, but they wanted you to kind of pretend that you're on a yacht in a little inlet between the ocean and the interior of the reef. And that's what that railing is in front of us. That's meant to mimic the wooden railing on a fine but rather small wooden yacht. So let's take a look at the next image, and you'll see a much better photograph of this wonderful painting. Now, these are amazing paintings that were done by the artists who have worked here. But you have to remember, this artist is not trying to make a beautiful painting. This artist is trying to make the painting disappear. The idea of these dioramas is that you are being transported to another place with just a little bit of imagination, perhaps. Now, I don't know if you can really see it, but what I want you to notice is the green colored water on the right. That's ocean water, but it's very, very calm. And on the left, in our pathway to the open ocean, you can tell it's pretty shallow from the shape of the waves, but there are waves, but they're gentle sorts of waves. If you can see on the left, a little bit above the green, just below the clouds, there's a thin line of deep blue. There you go. That's where the cursor is. And what that is the open ocean. You have breaking waves. You have wind-driven waves. And one of the functions that the coral reef gives us is it provides a calm place. So the coral reef is attractive to life for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it is a calm refuge away from what can be very, very wild waves, at least near the surface. So here's a question: are corals something that be grown or created by human? Well, created, we're talking about genetic manipulation and all that, and I really can't answer that. I know we've grown some things, starting in very basic sorts of molecules, but yeah, you can grow them. People put them in fish tanks. If you have a tropical fish tank, you are likely very aware that they can be kept indoors. And later on, we'll talk about growing them and harvesting them for other reasons. So, so this idea of how the coral works and why there are coral reefs at all is something that was discussed early in the 19th century. Scientists, geologists, like a fellow named Lyell, were proposing ideas on how this came to be. The British Royal Navy was very interested in these objects because they are hazards to navigation. And as the tide goes up and down, they can disappear and reappear. They can be just below the surface. So these long voyages around the world, they would carry these charts and have as accurate as they can. Where are these hidden dangers? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see somebody you may recognize. And that fellow on the left is Charles Darwin in his advanced years. But when he was on his voyage on the Beagle, the principal reason for setting sail was to basically nail down where these hazards are. It was to make these charts better. And for all of us, it's fortunate Charles Darwin went along as companion for Fitzgerald, the captain. They were friends. And we know that one of the things that Darwin knew is he knew about Lyell's idea. He had a book or two of his, I think. And so as they were going to these reefs, Charles Darwin developed and amended the ideas that existed at the time. A very clever idea about how the corals start growing, they become separated. For an atoll, it starts growing perhaps around a volcanic island, and then over time the volcano rock subsides after the volcano activity is gone, and the corals remain, and eventually all you have is the coral with a lagoon in the middle. And this made a lot of sense. And it was certainly in all the textbooks, maybe when a lot of you were growing up. Charles Darwin's ideas basically is what was in the textbooks. Now, more recently, we know things that Charles Darwin didn't know. And one of the things we know is how sea level has risen by great amounts. We're talking geological time, eons, millions of years, as climate has changed drastically. The Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets have grown and receded. The sea level has gone up and down by quite a bit, in tens of meters. And that affects the way that the coral grows. And so, we just have better ideas based on more information. But Charles Darwin pretty much figured it out, almost 200 years ago, 160 years ago, which is pretty good. So let's take some examples from our Andros Coral Reef. If you take a look at that red circle in the lower left, I don't know if you can make it out. I'd actually be surprised if you could. Toward the bottom of the red circle is a green Moray eel, M-O-R-A-Y. So this is what we're going to do. I'm just going to talk about a few of the animals mostly in here. So let's zoom in on this particular model of a Moray eel. And you see there's something growing out of its head. That's not in the actual animal. That is, I think, a little piece of string or wire to help hold it up. And it got a little dusty maybe. But it has a green color. In all other respects, it is extremely accurate. It is a model. And why is it green? It's a yellowish kind of green. Well, one of the things that the green moray eel will do, there are about 200 species of morays, about 600 species of eels, if you take the whole group together. One of the things that the green moray eel will do is it exudes kind of a mucus out of its skin. And that's what you see. It's the color of the mucus that you're looking at. And it is presumably to help protect it against parasites and infectious kinds of bacteria. So that's what's going on there. They can grow to be about 2.5 meters long. They can weigh about 30 kilos. Now, this is a carnivorous animal. It is active at night, and it's kind of at the top of the food chain, just about. And so it eats animals that eat other animals that eat other things. And so it actually accumulates toxins in its liver, and it's throughout its body. It doesn't bother the eel, but you have to be aware of that if you're a person that likes to eat eels. Now, you don't want to eat raw eel. Yeah, an eel is a kind of fish, absolutely. There are weird looking fish, and I would say that the eel qualifies as a weird kind of fish. So if you know about sushi, they serve eel in sushi, unadon, but that is cooked. One way to get the toxins out of the fish is to cook it. It's actually pretty easy, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it because you're going to do it wrong. And then whoever is around is going to come blame me. But just be aware that you don't want to be handling eels unless you know what you're doing. So we'll move on to the next animal. But first, here's a real eel. And what I want you to notice here is there's a shadow. And if you look at the twigs on the left, there's a shadow too. And that tells me that there was a flash that took this photograph. Because if you look at that poor eel's eye, it looks like it's got a cataract. And all I think that is a reflection, a weird reflection from the flash on the photograph. But you get the idea of what the eel looks like. And in its mouth, you can see teeth, sort of, but this is an animal that is biting its prey. Not all fish do that. Most fish don't do that. They eat through suction. Remember, they're in water. And if you just create a little bit of a muscular movement in your mouth, make your mouth bigger, you actually pull in water. And if the food is in that water nearby, you're pulling the food in, then you can chomp down and swallow. But the eel doesn't do that. It is using its jaws. but those don't look like very formidable teeth. But the eel has a really scary aspect to it. Let's take a look. If you look on the right, there's a cross section or kind of an X-ray view, and it says pharyngeal jaw. That blue is the jaw. That's, it's bone. Those are teeth down its throat. And the red part is muscle and sinew. So imagine that you are a nice tiny little fish minding your own business, and the eel comes along. No, they don't chew, they swallow. They swallow you whole if you're a fish. And, you think, oh, I'm in the eel's mouth, no big deal. The teeth are, I can get out of this. But before you know it, the eel pulls forward that extra set of teeth, an upper and a lower pharyngeal jaw, which have sharp pointy teeth pointed backward. You get hooked, you can't get out. It chomps down with them, and then it pulls the entire fish. It doesn't chew. It's, not the most polite sort of eater, but it just swallows it whole, pulls it down into its gullet, and that's what it does. And it seems to work pretty well. And it works pretty well for bad dreams. If you want to search around for some images and maybe some videos of these animals eating. So let me scroll down a little bit because I got caught ahead before. So the next thing we're going to look at is a trumpet fish. Now, I used to play the trumpet, so maybe that's why I picked this one, but it's in the red again. It's a skinny little fish, a kind of simple trumpet, perhaps. You can think of a long tube as a trumpet. But let's take a little closer look at it. Now, I mentioned that the eel is a not a chewing animal, but a biting animal. This is one of the more common kinds of carnivorous fishes that use that suction method. You can see on the right, its mouth is actually open, tiny little mouth, but it doesn't need to eat a lot. These trumpet fish are related to seahorses, and they're also related to cornet fish and to sea dragons. Did you know that there were real sea dragons? Well, if you Google an image of a sea dragon, it's actually kind of a funny looking seahorse. But, people are creative in how they name things. And so the next picture we have is so these are Western Atlantic trumpet fish. And this one's a little more brightly colored. And I just think it might be about how deep you find it, because as it gets deeper, the color sort of disappears. But you can actually see it swimming. I think I can. Its body is actually undulating. If you follow it from the nose to the tail, it's actually making kind of a little S shape. So it's not only wiggling its fins in the back there, but it's actually snaking along through the water. So the next thing we're going to look at, we're moving right along, is a kind of coral. Now, if you look at this part of the Andros Reef exhibit, there are many different kinds of coral. There are many elkhorn coral. There are some other kinds. They're actually soft-bodied coral, I believe, in there. But in the red there is a kind of brain coral. Now, it's not coral to brain coral because it's smart. If we look at the close-up, I think you'll get the idea on why it's called a brain coral. It's not only because it's round like your brain, but if you were to look at a brain outside of the body, a person or mammal's brain, you have these convolutions. And these convolutions are very much like the convolutions that you see on the surface of the brain coral. Remember, those coral animals, you don't see them here, but they are living on the surface. The part underneath is rock built by their ancestors. So this is a multi-generational sort of house. And the current generation is only living on the biggest outermost portion of this house. It could be there for quite a long time, hundreds of years perhaps. So if it looks like a brain, Maybe something about the structure can tell us something. Well, one thing I know about mammal brains is the convolutions increase surface area, and that seems to help in thinking more in different things. Uh, it makes it more complex, and more convolutions, the better. At least for this part of the brain. So extra surface area. So one of the things about coral animals, they make their calcium carbonate uh, homes, really, that they attach themselves to. And most of them make little homes around themselves. So you see those animals, and the hard part makes a circle around the base of them. And so they're all living together, but it's like they're living in their own little apartments. Yeah, I'm in the same building as my neighbors, but I don't live with them. And that's how most corals are. But look at these convolutions. These corals are different. They truly live as one colony, and they will actually share nutrients back and forth because they really are touching right next to each other. And that's good. But because they're touching each other, guess what? If there's a pathogen, if there's an infection, if there are infectious bacteria, they can also share that. So, there are advantages to being alone, and there can be disadvantage of being all together. Maybe you can find a parallel to what's happening in human society right now about being together and being apart, why it's good and sometimes why it's not so good. So we're going to leave the Andros Reef. Global warming. Oh my goodness. I am going to talk about global warming toward the end. If I don't run out of time, I think maybe we're okay. So what we're going to do, but remind me, because I really want to end talking about what is the fate of these extremely important parts of our world and what's happening now. But we're going to hold on to that for just a little bit. So this is a newer part of that same hall, the Hall of Ocean Life, and you can see in biggest letters in the middle on the right upper part, it says Coral Reefs. So on the mezzanine level of the hall, we have 8 habitat cases that are part of a redo of the hall from the year 2000. And so these are dioramas, but they're dioramas of a different kind. You see models, but you see very much presented differently. There's a lot more detail, there's more description, and there's a lot about the science, about what we understand, about how these animals behave, and what's happening in the world. So it's not just about ooh and ah, and isn't that interesting? And that can lead to, excitement. And then certainly that's what we want. But here it's a little different way of presenting pretty much the same subject. So what I'd like to do is to focus in on some other animals here. So in this exhibit, we have, excuse me. So this is an Indo-Pacific. This is where we are. This is a generalized reef that you might find in the Indian or Pacific Ocean. So first thing we're going to look at is another moray. So this is not a green moray. This is a giant moray. I apologize for the quality of the photograph. I actually took that one with my iPhone. There's not a lot of light in this particular part of this exhibit because it's hiding. The moray, the giant moray, like the green moray, they are active at night, and during the daytime, they will find a place to hide. And they only pop their head out when there's food around during the night. Okay, so these are giant morays. You can go to the other one. So this is a little clearer picture. This is a living giant moray. And they can, instead of 2.5 meters, they can get up to maybe 3 meters, maybe a little more than 30 kilograms. Now, there's something interesting I found out about where these guys live. Near the reef around here, there might be big fish who are also, top of the food chain predators. And one of them can be a fish called a grouper. and they can get to be a meter long, maybe. I mean, you know, we're talking a couple 100 kilograms, really big fish. And if you're a fish swimming around at night, you want to stay away from the group. And so one of the things you might do is swim away from the grouper and go into the reef to hide. And you go into the reef to hide, and that's really good for our giant moray, because that's when the moray is going to eat you. Or let's say you're a really smart fish and you know that there are groupers out there, and you know the best place to find food in a safe way is to hide in the reef. But you're a smart fish, so you do know that there are morays around. And if you see a moray, you're going to get out of the reef and you're going to leave the reef so you don't get eaten. And as you swim out of the reef, you go right into the mouth of the grouper. So here you have a relationship between the moray and the grouper. They don't know each other, they don't directly interact, but because one is there, the other is benefiting in this weird sort of scheme to catch food. So let's keep going. The next thing we have is another trumpet fish. We already talked about trumpet fish. This one can get a little bit bigger. Now, one of the schemes of trumpet fish is they will sometimes hide behind bigger fish. So let's say there's our grouper again, much bigger than this trumpet fish. Maybe a little less than a meter long, pretty big, but you know, maybe smaller. But it doesn't have to be a lot smaller. All it's doing is it's drafting, if you will, the grouper. It's just falling in behind it. And why would it want to do that? It's hiding. So as the grouper is moving along, there's a trumpet fish behind it. So once again, I'm going to make you the tiny little fish. You see the grouper and you swim away as fast as you can. You make it with your life. You're, you know, you're pretty happy. And then just as you drift behind, you get caught in the wake of that great big grouper, and you start drifting behind the grouper. And there's the trumpet fish, ready to open up its mouth, make a little suction, and away you go. The next one we're going to look at is another brain coral. Wait a second. We moved halfway around the world, didn't we? And what have I showed you? I've showed you another moray eel. I've showed you another trumpet fish. And now I'm showing you another brain coral. Are all corals the same? Coral reefs the same? What's going on? How does one get to be in a place where the other is? Some of these species, although they're different, they are remarkably similar. So this is a whole branch of biology, biogeography. And these scientists are very much interested in this question. Why are these places the same in so many ways? And why are there differences? How did the differences come to be? So very briefly, and it has to be briefly, because, you know, I only know so much anyway. But a simple answer is twofold. First of all, when we think about the oceans, we think about the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, the Southern, the Arctic. Did I leave any out? We think of them as separate oceans because that's convenient for humans. You know, we're interested in geography. But if you talk about the water in the oceans, more than 2/3 of the surface of the planet has water. It's actually all connected. And given enough time, the currents flow through all the oceans. So it's very possible that one organism halfway around the world could actually get carried very far away. The other mechanism is plate tectonics. The way that the oceans and land area is configured today is not the way it was millions of years ago. And when we think about human timescale, it's hard to imagine millions of years. But when we talk about the evolution of what we see on these reefs, we have to take into account very long timescales. And so it may be that a nearby area in the Pacific Ocean, what is now the Pacific Ocean, wasn't very far from what is now in the Atlantic Ocean. So at some time in the past, an ancestor of one of these animals may have found a home, and then through no fault of their own, they were carried apart. And now the scientists studying this will say, oh, look, I've done a gene sequence, I know where all the base pairs are, and I know about what the animal looks like, and I can see the differences, and maybe I can calculate how long ago they diverged in time. And then I look at the geological evidence, and maybe I can match it up, maybe I can't, maybe I have some fossilized evidence. And so what the scientist is doing is creating a picture of what the Earth looked like, not only physically, but biologically, and how it came to be. Now, there are some other fish that we didn't have before. Let me show you something really weird. So if you can read the label, it says flashlight fish, all one word. And those little bright spots underneath its eyes are the flash part. And inside there are bacteria that are using what we call a bioluminescence. And the chemistry, as little as I understand it, is pretty interesting if you want to look at it. But they produce light. And so you might guess that although we're seeing this in waters that are fairly shallow, because we're in a coral reef, that they are active at night. And yes, they are. And so they flash. And what the label is suggesting is one advantage is they're swimming along and you're a predator, you see the light and you say, oh, there are fish there. And you get your muscles moving you in the right direction, the right speed for an intercept course. And it's just before you get there, the light goes out and the fish is gone. So they have the ability to put a flap, kind of an eyelid, if you will, over the top of those translucent part of their skin where the light comes out. And so light on, light off, invisible, well, you can't see them anymore, and then they'll change direction. They can also kind of, there's a pouch there, and they can kind of suck in the bacteria also. So that'll dim them as well. So they have a lot of control over it. But there's more to it. Just a couple of years ago, a scientist, David Gruber, and one of his colleagues, John Sparks. By the way, David Gruber is a professor at City College in New York, and among other things. And John Sparks is one of the curators at the American Museum of Natural History, an ichthyologist. He studies fishes. And they were doing some research on something else. And they knew about flashlight fish, of course, and they saw them. And they saw that they were schooling. And this was behavior that no one really had observed, at least scientists, that made it known. It really wasn't a known behavior. And so they got the idea that there's another function for these bioluminescent bacteria and these flashlight fish. Because if you're going to school, that is, you know what schooling is, you get a bunch of fish, hundreds and hundreds of fish can be all swimming as one, and they react as one because, there are different ways they can sense each other. But it seems clear that one of the ways that they're able to school is they can actually see each other. And so what they proposed is that they are actually signaling each other with bioluminescence in order to achieve the schooling behavior. So the museum, just a little plug, it's not only the exhibits that you see when you come in, but it's very much like a research university. And we have scientists, we have an education department. There's a lot going on that you might not notice. If you look at our website, there's a whole tab on research if you want to take a look. So we're going to keep going. So speaking of scientists, before I talk about the daisy parrotfish there's another scientist who, a curator at the museum, Natalie Goodkin, and she works with coral reefs as well. And you can find videos that she's done. Basically, she works with the chemistry of the reefs and how it's changed over time. And she uses this chemical evidence to figure out about current patterns over time, about monsoons, about climate change. And she does that by taking cores into the ancient ancestors of the living corals and looking through the chemistry of what the previous coral generations have deposited, because what they deposit depends on what is in the ocean at the time. And there's a surprising amount of information that scientists can get from that. So this is a daisy parrotfish, and it looks really weird. This is a model, it's in the exhibit, and you see the parrotfish inside, very brightly colored. This is an animal that's active in the day, but we see it at nighttime. I know it's nighttime because there's a big bag around it. And that bag is a sort of invisibility cloak. And that brought to mind Wonder Woman. I'm not an expert on Wonder Woman either, but at least in some versions of the Wonder Woman character, she can turn her airplane invisible. And essentially, that's what the parrotfish is doing. It's turning itself invisible. It secretes mucus, and it makes this bag every night. And it goes to sleep comforted that it can't be seen. I'm not talking so much about with vision, but chemically. It is perhaps inhibiting odor. Now, we don't know exactly how this works, apparently, but it's also protecting against parasites that might take advantage of the immobile fish to find a home. So it's called a parrotfish, and you might think of a parrot, and that's why it's called it, because it looks like it has a beak in its mouth. But if you look at it closely, which we're going to do now, if you look on the right, that's actually a close-up of the thing that looks like a beak, but it's actually got, you see its little diamonds there, diamond shapes, excuse me, and those are teeth. So those are rows of teeth that have come together. And one of the ways, principal ways, I believe the parrotfish eats is it will grab up algae that will grow on coral. It doesn't go after the coral animals so much as the rock coral and other rocks where the algae grows. And it will nibble in so it can get the whole thing instead of, just little pieces. So Kayla, is it like a sleeping bag of invisibility? I suppose so. And now that you've put those words together, all of a sudden I am wanting my own sleeping bag of invisibility. How nice would that be? I don't know. I have to think about that. I like that. But yes, it is. Do you ever hear of a movie called Finding Nemo? In this exhibit, we can actually find Nemo. He or she is a clown. Well, Nemo is a clown anemone fish. And those orange projectile things are the anemone, poisonous. And once again, you have kind of a mutualistic sort of relationship. The stinging cells, by the way, the anemone and the coral animals are closely related. And like the anemone has stinging cells, the coral also, as far as I know, most of them have stinging cells. And the 10% of their energy from what's floating by, if it's alive, they will use the stinging cells to help it get its food. So the clownfish there is protected by the stinging cells. And you might not be aware of this, but fish poop. And the poop is rich in nitrogen. And one of the ways that the anemone seems to benefit from having the clownfish around is fertilizer. So, yeah, and scientists are still thinking about this. One idea, I'm not a scientist, but one idea that, I don't know, see what you think. I'm not too crazy about it. But the idea is that these colors on the fish, it's like, oh, there's something good to eat. And the whatever it is will come closer to the anemone and then get stung by the anemone and consumed by the anemone. Now, the anemone can't eat everything. Another advantage for the clownfish is not only protection, but it also gets to eat the leftovers. the undigested part of what the anemone is eating for supper. So the next one we're going to look at, if you remember the follow-up movie to Nemo, was something about Dory. Well, this isn't Dory. It is in the exhibit. These are a kind of damselfish. Dory is a very different kind of fish. The closest one probably to Dory would be a blue tang, T-A-N-G. And I'll let you look that up on your own. But reading about damselfish, there's a relative of these farmer fish, a kind of damselfish, that lives off the coast of Belize. And it's interesting, they call these farmer fish because that's what the ones in Belize do. They protect an area of coral that is inhabited by very tiny shrimp-like animals. And the shrimp-like animals interact with the algae there, and they fertilize the algae, and the algae grows very healthy, and that's what the damselfish eat. So if you want to get in on eat those shrimp, or you want to graze on those algae, you're going to have to fight your way through a protective army of damselfish. So I just found that extremely interesting, that you have these kinds of really unimaginable kinds of relationships. And remember, most of the ocean is, in fact, still unexplored. Now, someone asked about bleaching. And so the remainder of our time here, that's what we're going to talk about. So the next thing is you see a scuba diver. This is shallow water. You can see the streaks of sunlight in the water column there. And you see coral, but not coral animal. This is the detritus. This is the skeleton of a thriving coral reef. And it's been abandoned by the animals and by the algae, by the dinoflagellates and everything else that relies on that. So this Mekong Nevis, this is critical. How is global warming influencing the weakening of corals, and what can be done to reverse this case? The $1 million question, the $1 billion question, the $1 trillion question, because there are lots of things that will kill coral. But the principal thing, the thing that is probably most important for us today in the age we live, is in fact global warming. Global warming is really a warming of the planet. Us humans have been pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground to get energy, very clever. But one of the byproducts is we dump the carbon part, a lot of the carbon part, into the atmosphere. And that as carbon dioxide. And that affects how much heat is re-radiated out to space when we're heated up by the sun. And the net effect is that the temperatures are getting warmer. And what happens in the atmosphere affects the ocean. So the heat of the atmosphere is transferred into the ocean. And for these coral, just a 1 degree Celsius change in temperature makes these dinoflagellates abandon their host. They just have difficulty with a very slight change. And if you remember, 90% of the life energy for these coral animals comes from the dinoflagellates it's taken care of. And they leave, they only got, what falls around, what swims by. And generally, that's not enough to keep them alive. Now, if there's a recovery, if the temperature goes back down, generally they will come back on their own. But if the temperature stays warm for a long time, they may not recover. Now, part of the problem is I'm telling you a very simple scenario, and I barely have any confidence in how the way I'm describing how the coral react. This is still an area of basic research. There's been a lot of progress that I've read about in the United States. NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, and other parts of the government, they are monitoring this. They are sharing the information. There are scientists going out and studying various aspects of what happens, why is it bleaching, and what can we do about it? Can we take healthy coral from another area and see the place where the coral has died? Can we introduce super coral that are able to tolerate wider swings in temperature? But if we do that, how will it affect the ecosystem of the coral? Will it necessarily be different? Can we get back to the way it was? There are heroic efforts going on around the world to come up with solutions. But ultimately, the real solution is the most difficult solution. And that is to change what humans on this planet are doing as far as how we make the energy that we need to survive. That we're starting to. I'm an optimistic sort of person. And I look at how the world is changing right now, how we are moving away from relying on hydrocarbons. And I see that as a light for the future. But where we are right now is it's still a very big problem. The ocean is still warming. And if you want more to worry about, there's also a change in the chemistry. That carbon dioxide affects the chemistry of the water. It's becoming slightly more acidic. And those coral animals, when they go to make their skeleton, the calcium carbonate, the chemistry doesn't work as well. I'm not very good at chemistry, but like hydrogen ions, whatever in the water, the mix of them, the plentiful ratio, it changes. And so, it's less well understood, I guess, but, that's a problem too. And what you see here is what can happen. You have the dead coral, and you have a place where other kinds of algae can start growing, and they can overwhelm the area so that even if you were to try and reintroduce the coral that was there before, the coral animals, or even if the current carried some polyps. I didn't mention that the animals are called polyps individually. They might not be able to live in the same place because their homes have been taken over by these intrusive algae. So, do we have any other slides? I think that's about it. Yeah. I want to thank you all for being so patient, staying with me. So this is showing a possible outcome of reintroducing, reseeding. But we really can't rely on building it back up physically. We really need to change the conditions that caused the problem in the first place. You can't have one without the other. So I don't know. I'll kind of leave it there. If you have other questions, I'll be happy to try to tackle them. Otherwise, thank you again for coming and viewing our wonderful new video and meeting Steve Quinn and learning a little bit about corals. And I hope this gets you to learn more.